The 2022 season was perhaps the biggest shakeup in Formula One since the introduction of turbo-hybrid power units. And that, of course, also meant that someone else was finally stepping up to break the extremely long spell of Mercedes' dominance. But while the W13 was a difficult beast to tame, the Silver Arrows didn't actually know about it until it was already too late. How does something like that happen, though? Well, let's find out. First off, Mercedes wasn't aware of its porpoising issues. Porpoising was the big talking point in Formula One, especially during the first half of the season. Since the new aero regulations required the cars to produce downforce via ground effect, the issue was something that most people saw coming. After all, this isn't the first time we've had ground effects cars in the sport. What they didn't see coming, however, was the extent of this problem. Seriously, while some of that bouncing castle effect was always supposed to make the cars move up and down on the straights, it wasn't meant to be so bad that it hurt drivers. But of course it did, so much so that Lewis Hamilton almost didn't make it through the Azerbaijan Grand Prix due to back pain. Oh, and let's not forget all the lateral G's the drivers were pulling, which would almost make them faint by the time they reached a corner. That said, even though the majority of the grid was porpoising its way through the straights, the Mercedes W13 was maybe the worst car in this regard. Now obviously, it was already surprising enough to see the German team struggle like that. You know what's even more fascinating? They didn't even know they had this issue until after the Barcelona test. Also, to make matters worse, they introduced their quote-unquote revolutionary zero-pod design a couple weeks later, which, well, we know what that did. The point is that the Silver Arrows campaign was sorta doomed from the start, and they realized it a bit too late to salvage it in any decent amount of time. Up next, why didn't Mercedes detect the porpoising before Barcelona? Now remember, the German outfit was heading into the season after winning 8 Constructors' Championships in a row. Like, they were the dominant team, and no one could even come close to them in terms of engineering. What's more is everyone was expecting them to pull up at the start of the season with another one of their revolutionary rule-bending systems like the DAS. What actually ended up happening was beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Mercedes had screwed up the development of their car, which again, we can't stress just how much of a big deal that was. Things weren't always looking bleak for them though. In fact, the team actually topped the timesheets at Catalunya, even after they made some very last-minute changes to ride height and the floor to make their car legal. Not to mention they'd also spotted the porpoising issue back in February when they were testing the car in their own facility. So the question remains, why didn't they fix it? Well, according to the team's director of trackside engineering, Andrew Shovlin, the porpoising wasn't concerning at the time, and it was only when they ran the W13 in its race specification that they realized just how steep of a hill they'd have to climb in 2022. So the season unraveled in the worst way imaginable. It almost felt like someone had cursed them or something. Seriously, after they'd fixed the porpoising a few months into the season, it was revealed that they also had an issue with suspense stiffness over bumps. Not to mention, the issues also slowed down the development process. Yep, the worst thing about the W13 was that if you fixed one thing, something else would break. Take porpoising for example. The team increased the ride height to help with that, but it brought new suspension issues into the mix. Plus, the car also got way too draggy, which meant a pretty big pace deficit on the straights. As a result, the German outfit struggled to develop upgrade packages for the year, as it couldn't even figure out a solution for its existing problems. At least not one that didn't feel like it was being held together by some duct tape. And according to Shovlin, it was just a series of unfortunate events. He talked about how the W13 didn't even get a proper shakedown at Silverstone in February because Storm Eunice was still raging across the UK. So these were hands down the worst conditions to run a car in, meaning they didn't get any useful data while filming either. What's more, the Mercedes director mentioned how they arrived in Catalunya still feeling confident because even though they did have porpoising issues, they'd been tinkering with the ride height to make some calculated compromises. In fact, he even added that the team felt like it was in a good place after Barcelona testing because apparently they were hedging their bets on the zero-pod concept to come in at Bahrain and fix both the performance and the porpoising problems. For them, being close to the top was good enough, as they still had the ace hidden up their sleeve. Now, for the disastrous zero-pod concept. Alright, let's rewind back to Bahrain for a sec. When the Silver Arrows pulled up to the preseason testing with their new concept, everyone thought they'd done it again. After all, just how many times had we seen them do something similar over the past decade? Besides, no one really understood how the cars worked anyway, cause most teams had very different philosophies for their side pods. Ferrari, for instance, had those massive sink-like troughs in its side pods, while Red Bull had gone for a more boxy approach. But obviously these variations were expected after a change in the rulebook anyway. What wasn't expected, however, was Mercedes' radical design. The W13 was nothing like the other cars on the grid. In fact, it didn't have any side pods at all, which was absolutely bonkers for a couple reasons. 1. How are they going to direct airflow to the wings efficiently with the setup? And 2. What about the engine cooling? Seriously, the whole thing was so tightly packed that it would have been a marvel of modern engineering had it actually worked. Not to mention the sheer drag reduction gains they'd get from this were also shaping up to be insane. It was truly truly a mad scientist's wildest dream brought to life. But of course, the Silver Arrows flew too close to the sun and burned their wings. The compromised performance gains never materialized, and the fabled zero-pod concept ended up making things worse, as the team struggled to find the right setup for the W13. In fact, the car had such a narrow operational window that everyone started calling it a diva. Coming up, the misguided development ruined the season for Mercedes. As we've mentioned earlier, the biggest issue wasn't even the porpoising itself. The team was going to fix that eventually anyway. The actual concern for the Silver Arrows was that they couldn't bring significant upgrade packages either. Plus, they'd also have to scrap the concept and start from scratch for the 2023 season, which would also give them a handicap. So basically, that one mistake in testing ended up costing them dearly, and we could see the effects of that well into the next season as well. In fact, Chauvelin even admitted that the team fell into the trap and lost a large part of its season due to a misguided development. If you thought that was the end of their issues though, buckle up, because apparently the porpoising affected their engines too. Speaking in an end-of-year video published by Mercedes, the team boss, Toto Wolff, talked about how all the bouncing was actually breaking their engines ever so slightly. In fact, the performance delta was so big that engineers at the factory couldn't figure out why the car wasn't getting the same power as it did in the tests. But of course, as it turns out, the insane porpoising was the culprit behind this loss of power too. Wolff said that the engines were taking a hell of a pounding, so much so that some of the parts would come off after the races. And according to him, it was a miracle that they didn't have that many engine failures in hindsight. Moving on, Wolff's still positive about the W13's legacy. Now, the W13 is a car that destroyed Mercedes' streak of Constructors' Championships, so we're sure the team doesn't look back at it very fondly. And that's what Wolff echoed in his recent interview with Motorsport.com as well, saying that the car will always have a special place in their collection, except very far back. Having said that, he did talk about how he hopes to see the W13 in a different light a few years from now. Why? Well, for him, this was the ideal object for the team to learn from, meaning that it wasn't totally worthless. Not to mention, it did sort of become competitive again by the time we reached Austin, so it wasn't that bad by the end of the season either. So if the Silver Arrows learn from this experience and end up returning to the top with their future car, it's all going to be worth it. Besides, they could still use a lot of the concepts from this design in the future when they've got a better grasp on everything else. Finally, Hamilton gives his verdict on the W13. It was a difficult year for Mercedes, but it was perhaps even harder for Lewis Hamilton, who for the first time in his long Formula One career didn't win a single Grand Prix throughout the season. In a recent interview with the team, the 7-time world champion revealed how it almost felt like there was a ghost in the car because it was all over the place. What's more, he also said that they started with a car that they didn't want and finished with a car that they didn't want. Yeah, the year was a write-off for him, though he still believed the year was empowering for him and the team, saying that this challenging period was going to stoke the flames within everyone. So now it's all about rebuilding and making sure they come back stronger next year to reclaim their throne at the top of Formula One. That's a wrap for this video. Do you think Mercedes will return to winning ways in 2023? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.